and welcome to today's program, a 360 view of the Texas grid. I'm Sherry Richard and will serve as moderator. We have a fantastic program today, so without further delay, I will introduce our panel. Pat Wood III currently serves as Chief Executive Officer of Hunt Energy Network and as a Director for SunPower, Spring Valley Acquisition Corporation, and Quanta Services. He also serves as a director and chair for Luma Energy. Additionally, he serves on the executive board of Big Brothers and Big Sisters Lone Star. Pat is also a past head, of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, or PUCT, and a past chairman for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, commonly called FERC. Throughout his career, Pat has been a forceful advocate for customer-centered technology unleashing competition, and for robust infrastructure. Thank you, Pat, for joining us.
Thank you, Sherry.
Ned Ross serves as a consultant and attorney and is the owner of Ned Ross Strategic Services. Ned was elected by industry peers and served as the retail electric segment member of the board of directors for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, more commonly called ERCOT, in 2019 and 2020. Ned has served numerous philanthropic organizations, including the board of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute and the Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas. Ned's experience spans many roles, including legal and regulatory, land acquisition, and energy trading for regulated and competitive energy businesses. Ned also spent several years with Direct Energy overseeing Texas governmental and regulatory affairs for the company, including during the acquisition of Direct Energy by NRG. Ned previously worked with NextEra Energy, Duke Energy Trading, Dynegy, Louisiana Resources, and United Gas Pipeline Company. And thank you, Ned, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Todd Staples was named president of the Texas Oil and Gas Association, or TXOGA, in 2014. TXOGA is the oldest and largest oil and gas trade association in Texas, representing every facet of the industry. TXOGA's diverse membership represents over 80% of Texas crude oil and natural gas production, operates over 80% of the state's refining capacity, and is responsible for a vast majority of the state's pipeline network. Todd has worked to pass legislation to preserve the infrastructure development while improving the rights of private property owners, clarify the state regulation of oil and gas, and advance science-based policies and regulations that benefit both our economy and environment. Prior to TXOGA, Todd served as a Texas Agricultural Commissioner. He also served in the Texas Senate and Texas House of Representatives. And thank you, Todd, for joining us.
Thank you, Sherry.
All three of our panelists obviously have vast experience in various aspects of the Texas energy landscape. They bring the ability to truly take a 360 view of the Texas grid. So let's get to it. Pat, let's start with you from the big picture perspective. And please share a bit of history with us. Broadly speaking, the lower 48 is served by three grids: the Eastern grid, the Western grid, and the Texas grid. How did Texas come to have its own independent grid?
It's a story worthy of a TV miniseries. Of course, we've all watched a few of those during COVID. This one might have been in somebody's top 10, but their utilities in Texas were all just serving Texans. So we didn't trigger. This was back before, like say in the 60s. We didn't serve people in Louisiana with most of our utilities. I grew up in Port Arthur, where actually the utility there does serve Louisiana and Texas. But the ERCOT part of Texas, which includes Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, not quite as far as El Paso, not quite as far as Amarillo, but everywhere in the valley. So 85% of the people in our state are inside the ERCOT grid. And those grids were never interconnected with the rest of the US. So we didn't trigger the US Constitution requirement that federal jurisdiction only applies where there's interstate commerce. So where there's between states. Texas is such a big state that we really could have and have had successfully our own electric power system independent of everybody else's. We didn't need to lean on anybody else substantially. But once there was a utility merger in the 70s with an Oklahoma utility, that created overnight a link between Oklahoma and Texas. And that created a huge firestorm with the other utilities in Texas. And so they ran straight to FERC, which was the federal regulator. So we're going to cut a deal and you're going to bless it. At the time, I think there was a Texan on FERC, just like when I was there. They pushed the deal through, which did not change Texas jurisdiction, but did allow that utility merger to go forward. So that was old Central Southwest. Now it's part of a company called AEP. But anyway, Texas has moved forward with jurisdiction. The law has been actually updated twice to really lock that in. But it was just a great story of kind of classic Texas of leave us alone. We want to be in our own way of running things. And it's worked pretty well. As I guess I was the only person, at least alive to date, that got to be the head regulator over both of those two grids. And I'll tell people it's a fun bragging right, but as a practical matter, it's not made a whole lot of difference. But it is a good Texas story that fits our stereotype pretty well.
And thank you, Pat. And with that bit of history as a backdrop, let's shift gears and focus for a few minutes on what went wrong during Winter Storm Uri. And so, Ned, according to a report prepared by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, often called NERC, there's all these acronyms for all of these different organizations, ERCOT was forced to load shed about 20,000 megawatts during the worst points of Winter Storm Uri, leaving thousands without power for extended periods of time. What went wrong?
Well, I'm going to try to be acronym free, so keep me honest. We'll use ERCOT because that's one we're all pretty familiar with by this point. I don't think Murphy's Law would accurately describe what happened, but I suspect if I were in the throes of trying to restore power last year, it would sure feel like it. An awful lot went wrong. Some things went right, but at the outset, I do want to emphasize that the energy delivery systems we have, gas, power, liquids, all those things are very incredible. An in-depth look as you dive into it in infrastructure, the integration and the interdependence between those grids is, it only deepens your appreciation for how well they work, but it also makes you appreciate how fragile they are and how delicate they are. So these systems, as incredible as they are vulnerable. And so it's pretty much a marvel that we have 24-hour power. So ERCOT, the other note I want to make is that ERCOT is an operator. ERCOT owns nothing. They own no wires, no generation, no fuel, okay? They're not in the business of owning anything. They are simply an operator for other people's assets. And that was kind of lost in the storm. So I just want to make sure everybody understands ERCOT is just an operator of all these other assets, and they make it all integrate and function together. So if I grouped it all together and said what went wrong, I had three basic categories, and I would say weather, obviously, mechanics, and then communications in various forms. So in terms of the weather, Uri was absolutely enormous in geographic size, and in terms of sustained low temperatures, crippling precipitation, early gusts of wind that caused the rain to blow horizontally and freeze things, and then ultimately no wind, so our wind turbines stopped spinning. The roads became impassable. We had water systems freeze up. It was just an infrastructure nightmare. Not only did Texas experience this, but adjacent states did as well. In fact, all the way up through the mid-continent, this was a massive storm that knocked out power in a broader region. So it's important to note that the adjacent grids were also having problems. In terms of the mechanical devices and the failures that we had, our power and natural gas sectors have become, as I mentioned earlier, largely interdependent, and that's been over the last 30 years. Gas pipelines are increasingly using electric compressors to move gas along the pipeline systems. As you do that, your gas systems now become dependent on power, and your power systems are wholly dependent on gas. If you're burning gas to generate power, you can see the linkage here is causing a problem over time. Well, these electric compressors on the gas systems were a result of EPA wanting to clean up the emissions from those compressors, which is a laudable goal, but it also makes us more vulnerable. So I just want to point that out, that's one of the issues. Some power plants had sufficient fuel, so they had adequate gas supply or coal or nuclear supply. but they tripped because a single line or a single gauge on these massive devices got a false reading because of the freezing, or the line actually froze up. A small component on a large machine can cause the entire unit to trip. And that happened many, many times, okay? And it didn't just happen to many different units, it happened many times to each of a number of units. So that was a huge problem for the system over time. The third issue is communications, and that's kind of a twofold issue. One is the critical infrastructure issue. Every utility has a critical infrastructure list of assets that should not be curtailed in emergency situations. And so when the storm was becoming imminent, the utilities were looking at their critical infrastructure list to make sure they had them. As outages began to occur, everybody that was on the list would not get curtailed, okay? And what happened was some of the entities did not submit their critical infrastructure forms, including oil and gas assets, natural gas production, had not submitted their forms, partly because there has been so much turnover in the oil and gas sector with new assets being acquired and sold, and other reasons, but all those forms didn't get submitted. So some gas supply was lost simply because they didn't submit a form. Okay, and we'll talk about how that's been fixed since later on. But just realize that that was a very, very simple thing that could have prevented some loss of gas right up front and kept more power on. And if you keep more power, if you keep more gas flowing, you keep more power on the system. And I believe there was actually a cascading problem there with loss of gas meant loss of power, which meant loss of gas, and it just continued on for a while. So I think we fixed a lot of that already. The other communications issue is among the decision makers, and realize we were already in COVID. And in this case, it was kind of a mixed blessing. COVID was great because we had already developed these systems for video conferencing like we're using here, and phone networks from homes. So that's great. The downside was folks were isolated because of the storm. And isolated because of COVID. So that made it more difficult. So ERCOT, in terms of ERCOT, what went wrong with ERCOT? They operated ERCOT, in my opinion, very well. I thought they did a laudable job. They follow a very thick manual of instructions, and an old school visual would be like an 8 to 12 inch thick binder full of operational rules. That's how they operate. And they kind of followed that protocol all the way through the process. The only thing that they really had discretion on was that the CEO and other senior folks at ERCOT had to decide when to begin rolling outages. And they didn't want to do that too soon for obvious reasons. When you cut power off to people in frigid temperatures, you're risking injury or death. And in fact, we did. And so that instruction was taken very seriously by ERCOT and was delayed as long as possible. But that is one gray area where they have some discretion. But I thought they did a fine job of it. And in terms of demand side, one of the things that went wrong was we had been probably from beginning of time, we have been doing rolling outages by turning people off by circuit. So by electrical circuit, not by meter. If you have a critical infrastructure device on your circuit, generally speaking, you were not curtailed. Okay. My neighborhood has a water treatment plant at the top of the hill. 300 homes in my neighborhood never lost power. Okay. No reason why we should be powered through the entire storm and someone else is not. But that's how electrically we've been set up. That's all changing now too. We're going to go down to the meter. What that does is expands the pool of people who can then be wearing part of that outage. And then it shortens the outage for everyone. That absolutely has to occur. So that's already underway. And then why did plants fail? Just very quickly, why did they fail in Texas when it gets much colder up north and it didn't fail up north? Well, plants in Texas are designed to operate here. They're designed to withstand brutally hot temperatures. They're built outdoors for that reason, to improve cooling, but they're not designed for bitterly cold temperatures. And we just happen to get below those design temperatures for those units, and it caused problems. So that's a very quick summary to say what went wrong.
Thank you, Dad. And Todd, let's shift to you. In 2021, Texas energy sources as fuel for power generation were about, I'm rounding these numbers, 40% for natural gas, 25% wind, 20% coal, 10% nuclear, and 4% solar. There was a very common perception during and after Storm Uri that it was the renewables that failed, but in reality, all of our energy sources failed. So what went wrong, especially in the natural gas world?
Sure, you're exactly right. Every power generation source had challenges. Ned called it Murphy's Law. I don't think Pat's a year or two older than me, maybe. He might remember this, but I don't think there's ever been a time in Texas history where all 254 counties have been declared disaster areas all at the same time. So it was a extremely unique situation. It did impact every single power source. And so in our goal in looking at this is what do we need for a reliable electric grid? It's kind of lost on many, I think, that the oil and gas industry, yes, we are big producers of natural gas, but we're also big consumers of energy. I mean, our industry are probably some of the biggest consumers of electricity in the state. And so it is very important to us to have a very stable, effective electric grid. And looking at Uri, when you step back and kind of look at the framework, ERCOT did an analysis and said that for the reasons for unplanned outages at the power generation facilities was about 12% due to fuel limitations. And then FERC and NERC did a subsequent report to that. And the way their data came in, they had a lot of different information, put it in different buckets. And one of their numbers was like 27% for fuel issues, but included in that were power outages, which I don't consider a fuel limitation issue. I look at that as something else that Ned referred to about communications on a visit about. But included in that 27% number were power outages and contracting issues. If you make general assumptions about that data, it leaves you very generously assuming about 15% were due to fuel limitations. And when I think of fuel limitations, that's the inability to get gas because of a lack of product flow to a power generation unit. And so looking at Texas, we know that fuel limitations were about 12 to 15% of the reason for those outages. Ned mentioned communications. I think it's very important to understand that ERCOT has a form called Application for Critical Load Serving Natural Gas-Fired Electric Generation. And this is the form that is given to people so that they can register their asset as a critical load. Pre-Uri, that form said that it is not intended to apply to field services. And so those in the natural gas community read that form and we kind of dismissed it because we thought we were ineligible for critical load designation based on the wording of that form and the current decision makers who manage that. Since Uri, that has been corrected, I'm sure we'll get into, but the loss of power was the biggest factor for the decline production that we faced. There were also, the term freeze off is used quite frequently. Some people call it freeze offs at the wellhead. I think that really is a misindicator of what's occurring because oil and water and gas all comes up at most oil facilities. That comes up at 100 to 200 degrees. So if you keep hot liquids moving, you really don't have freeze offs. It's later on in the distribution, transmission, gas compression facilities, those types of things where you have some freeze offs. So loss of power was a huge factor. There were mechanical freezing issues up and down the supply chain. There were inability to get people on the roads to get to these sites. Keep in mind, we have 250,000 oil and gas wells in Texas. Most of them are all remotely located. They are unmanned operations. When you lose telecommunications, those wells are shut in because you can't tell what's going on there. And so looking at our systems, we've taken this very to heart. It's a surprise to many based on what we've read that most oil and gas operators employ winterization protocols. In fact, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars of doing it. Things like methane injection units, heat tracing systems, temporary wind structures. They do all these kinds of things. But there's some things we learned, and we can talk about that. But natural gas system has been improved significantly, and looking at the storm, those are the kind of observations that we have to date.
Thank you for that clarification, Todd. I think that was incredibly helpful. And a lot of us don't understand what was happening at the wells around the state. We shift gears for just a moment. Pat, I'm going to come back to you. During the storm, prices rose to $9,000 per kilowatt hour. How does pricing work in the Texas market? And why was $9,000 per kilowatt hour chosen or set as the rate? And what was the impact of that rate across the system?
Great question. When we set up the market in 99, getting ready to open for pilot program in 01 and go full competition for retail market in 2002, there really weren't a whole lot of time spent on market design. We just said, if you got power to sell, you sell it into the market, and then it's paid for by the consumer of who uses it. And so we built a market that cleared statewide for all the power plants that sold power, whether they owned by a utility or former utility or the city of Austin or San Antonio or one of the co-ops or an independent producer. They all sold power into an open market. So basically, we do that still today. I run a battery company and we bid in our batteries. Windmills bid theirs in. Sometimes if you want to bid zero, you'll just take whatever the market clearing price is. But most people bid in their cost. And so that market price kind of sets a supply and demand cost that wherever on that cost curve it is. Many days it's $20, $30. I think today it might have, this morning with the cold front coming through North Texas, it got up in the 90s, maybe even touched 100. I haven't looked closely enough. But as that storm came in a year ago, we knew it was going to be real tight. And so what happens there is those prices go way up, and it clears based on what's available. If there's a lot of wind blowing, that tends to crush price. And the gas producer or the gas driven power plants don't like that. But there's a lot of solar. We're getting a lot of solar, and we have a sunny day, not like today, which is pretty cloudy, I think, statewide. You don't have a lot of solar energy. So those things change every day and multiple times during the day. So that price can vary all the time. We got up to $9,000, which was the regulatorily set price cap. When I was regulator outside Texas, those price caps were lower. They're more like $1,000. And even in California, when they had an energy crisis 25 years ago that I had the joy of going to help pick up the pieces from, it was down to $150. But by and large, the $1,000 price cap is kind of everywhere else. But those markets have other streams of revenue to producers. In Texas, we do what we call energy only market, which means on the buy sell market on every hour of the day, that's how you get paid for what you're doing. So you get paid for, if you're a gas fired plant, for example, that Todd's customers would sell their gas to, those power plants have to recover the cost of the gas that they bought from one of our producers and transported on one of our pipelines. But they also have to pay for the fixed cost of their power plant, the men and women who work there, and the maintenance and the taxes and all that on that. So those costs have to be covered by this open market. So we set a cap at 9,000, full well knowing that we probably wouldn't never hit it very much. But if we did, it would stop there. And that number was set based on what is the average value of lost load. If somebody said, I'll take $9,000 and you can cut off my power. So it was really honestly just an economic study in 2014 when they adopted that price cap. They had moved it up from 5,000 at the time to 9. It has since dropped to 5,000. I think everybody viewed that the $9,000 price cap, which right in the middle of the crisis, and this is kind of out there in the news today, but in the middle of the crisis, the PUC pulled that price up and said, we're going to hold it there because we've got to entice every ounce of generation that's available anywhere in the state of Texas, whether it's a big power plant or somebody with a recip behind their house like I've got here. Bid it, put it into the market. We need everything to keep the lights on, to keep people from dying, to keep water mains from bursting in Corpus Christi of all places. And as Todd pointed out, it was 254 counties. We had snow in Brownsville for the first time since I think before men flew an airplane. So, I mean, it was a dramatic storm, but it was one where we were calling the whole cavalry out from every state to come help. And so that's what actually probably exacerbated the problem, is that price was held up artificially because there was no power to be had. The plants were either running full out or they were kaput, either from freezing or from just being overtaxed in the middle of a really tough season. From their also fuel, Todd mentioned that some have lost their fuel as well. So that happened on coal plants. We had a nuclear plant go down, windmills were frozen. Solar doesn't happen at night, so we weren't even counting on them. But anyway, everything kind of went wrong. And so they held up the price in hopes that the economic signal would pull that out. And it held it up for 4 days, and it pulled out certainly some generation, but at the end of the day, that interference with the market cost the state a lot. And that's being litigated right now before the court. It's hard as a former regulator to look back and say, gosh, that was not the right thing to do, because you don't like the armchair quarterbacks when you're trying to keep people from dying and trying to keep the lights on as many places as you can and keep the hospitals running and the water mains from bursting. All that kind of stuff is so much more important, and we'll clean up the money later. And so we are cleaning up the money. It was a lot of money. We're cleaning it up. The legislature gave the PUC, ERCOT, and the Railroad Commission some tools to do that and spread those costs over time. But it was an expensive storm. And the $9,000 price cap was just right there in the middle of it.
Yeah, Pat, I just want to point out, you guys designed that market and actually have huge industrial loads that volunteer to come off. It's part of the market design that they're designed to come off to preserve electricity for other critical needs, right? And so so a lot of that load had already prepared to go off. Other loads did not, but I think it's an important element that folks understand that this market is very price driven. It's designed to get those guys off who are willing to go off and not only avoid the $9,000 price, but actually get paid to do it. And that's the way it's actually a brilliant market design, and it works.
We probably could put more people on that pay to be cut off plan, and the PUC
that's already underway. Yeah,
they pushed that open, saying, if we don't, we can do everything we can, Sherry, to manage the supply. And weatherizing the power plants was a big step the legislature and the PUC took. We're working on that with regard to the gas system as well. That's a little bit longer because, as Todd mentioned, there's hundreds of thousands of inputs to that system, not just several hundred. But that's fixing the supply side. But we really haven't done a whole lot to talk about the demand side. But what Ned pointed out just a second ago is the key one, is you've got some really big customers on the system who, if they take their load off, and a lot of time they do just in response to price, because they go, if it's over $100 a megawatt hour, we're going to let our people go fishing for the weekend and turn the plant off early, and just let's take that load off the system and save ourselves a bunch of money. And so those did. But even then, with that extreme cold, that demand was so high. What's happened, and one thing I like to bring people into knowledge on, is when I was a kid, about 10% of our homes were heated by electricity. All the rest of us had natural gas heating, and that worked just fine. But now, maybe it's a success of the electric markets, or maybe it's just people being cheap. But in any event, 61% of the homes in Texas are heated by electricity. From 10% to well over half of the homes are heated by electricity. And that is admittedly a very inefficient way to heat your home. Even with a high efficiency heat pump, there's nothing quite like natural gas. When you bring the natural gas to your home and you heat it there and burn it there to heat your home and keep you warm there, that is the efficient way. But it's also a way that emits carbon. And so there's a push throughout our economy to decarbonize. And so one of those ways to do that is to not use natural gas in that form, which really did cost us a lot. On February the 15th last year, is we had probably one half of the whole demand of Texas, which is a record-setting winter demand on Valentine's night. One half of that was to heat residential homes, and that heat draw just came up and up and up all night long. As that temperature went down and down and down, those heaters never turned off, and more of them kicked on as people tried to be good citizens and set it at 65 or set it at 62. It didn't matter. Those things kept heating on, and they really kind of drove us over the edge. So, the demand side is just, and it's a hard thing to fix, but it actually, looking over the whole system of what we could do, it's probably the cheapest thing we can do to fix what happened.
Well, I'm going to skip forward on my question list that you all received because I think that's a natural lead, and we'll come back to the others. Pat, you co-authored an excellent article titled "Never Again: How to Prevent Another Major Texas Electricity Failure." And if you haven't read it, everyone, I highly recommend it. It's interesting and it's an easy read. And that article contains several recommendations regarding what we can do to impact and improve reliability, but also to moderate demand. Maybe you would like to expand on that just a little bit, Pat, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions.
Yeah, I don't want to take away from the other two guys who are smarter than I am on all this fun stuff, and I don't get to hear them enough. But the demand side's an important part. I mentioned one aspect of that, but like Ned said, if you put prices in front of people, they'll react. I was a customer of this former company called Gritty, and boy, did I react, because they told me the prices would be over $1 a kilowatt hour, which is $1,000 a kilowatt hour, and boy, I had a real incentive to switch providers real quick and get into a free night's plan. But those price signals are not what most of us see. We see an average rate that's an annual rate, 10 cents or something over a year, that you don't really get a strong price signal. So the price signals are one thing. One area that no one has talked about yet today that I think is important, and is important for the PUC yet to address, was how those rolling outages were handled. As Ned pointed out, they when we curtail people in these very rare emergency events, we do it by feeder and we try to roll it. What happened is the demand that was cut was 20,000 megawatts, I'm sorry, about a fourth of the state's load at the time, maybe a third. And that's a lot of lines that you have to take out of commission to get up to that 20,000. And so if you're trying to preserve a hospital and a police station and a jail and a water treatment plant and maybe an old folks home, all those kind of things on a load, they add up. And so when you're on a feeder with a hospital, you lucked out. If you're a residential customer that lived near a hospital, you probably didn't have these dramatic outages that a lot of us endured. But that the utilities have not really been forced until now to really think about their system in a much more granular way. And so that's what I think is yet a piece of work yet undone, is that ability to really break that distribution system, that last mile of the wires before it comes to your house or your business. Those need to be treated in a different way than we did during the freeze. Because when we take out a system to keep one person on, the other 99 get to stay on, and so that doesn't give you a whole lot of flex in the system. And a lot of the gas producers, for example, had that did not indicate they were critical facilities, because either they didn't know about it, or maybe they were just being nice, saying, gosh, I sure wouldn't want to run unless somebody was going to be cut off and maybe die. I wouldn't want to do that. So when you add all those new critical facilities in there that the state has said, gas facility, you are critical, so you've got to be on this list, that list is now even more crowded than it was before the freeze last year. So we've got to manage that ability to do rolling outages. And again, I hope we never have to go through this again. I think we learned a lot, and a lot of the changes that have been made just in this last year alone. We've got more to do, but the ones that have been made definitely moving in the right direction. We were lucky we had a good test of that about a month ago, 3 weeks ago. It wasn't as bad a test as it could have been. And so the storm was Landon, I think I'm so used to hurricanes having names. I never used to winter storms having names, for crying out loud. But these tests of our system are important, but we've got to continue to make those changes throughout the entire run of the system. That includes the gas system, the power grid, the power delivery system, and all the power generation, plus demand. All those kind of 5 pots of issues, I think, are the key ones I like to think about, Sherry, which would be, again, gas, big power delivery, which wasn't really that impacted this time around, local power delivery, which was power generation, and then demand. All those things really go into the mix of making a modern power grid work.
Thank you, Pat. And so we're still kind of generally in that category, what has changed. And Todd, do you have anything you want to add in terms of natural gas?
Sure. Based on Pat's and Ned's comment, everybody's going to sell out and buy near a hospital or a water treatment facility. That's a big takeaway from today's conversation. Now, natural gas is a lot has changed. The legislature spent, in my career, I cannot think of a single topic that they have spent as much time digging into trying to find solutions. They passed a host of different pieces of legislation. One of the big things that has been mentioned already is designation of a critical asset, designation for critical load. And so the Railroad Commission has required the natural gas system, including things, third-party assets like a saltwater disposal well or something in the supply chain that is so critical to keeping the power on, to be designated as critical asset, critical load at the Railroad Commission, and also to designate that asset at their transmission distribution utility so that they can be kept on the list to keep your power on. Those are key things. Now, there's a lot of zealous appetite out there just to have everything designated as critical. But in a load shed situation, it is essential that you identify those assets that are most impactful to the system. Pat mentioned what you'd want to take off and keep on, and Ned did, about the high price of electricity is a great incentive for industrials to stop using it and to return it back in the system. If you think about oil and gas wells, particularly in the Permian, they're in the oil business, not the gas business. So you may have some wells that produce so little gas, it takes more electricity to keep that well operating than it does to put gas into the system. So that has changed significantly. Number one, designating those critical assets, and that's going to continue to be refined. The PUC is in charge of mapping our system. They're going to start at the power generation units and map infrastructure to be able to identify what type of infrastructure is tied to them so that we can make sure and keep the power on those systems. That's very important. But industry always does an after action assessment. Anytime there's an incident, industry is very good about bringing the best engineers in the room and finding out what can we do better. And so while we know that oil and gas operators did employ, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of winterization protocols pre-Uri, we've also learned that, and what many companies are doing now, are pre-positioning personnel to where they'll be closer to their assets to be able to respond in times of a forecasted big weather event. They're also bringing in additional personnel so there won't be any downtime during shifts. Our midstream companies are doing something called line packing, which you have hundreds of thousands of miles of pipelines in this state. There's about, I don't know what the exact number is of big transmission lines, but it's a great volume of supply of gas. And so they're pressurizing their systems fully before the storm events. It's making a big impact of that continued movement. And another thing that we know also through this storm is that storage is the real key. There are a lot of states that don't have natural gas production, right? So they get natural gas transported in, but they also rely heavily on storage. They rely heavily on dual fuel capacity at the power generation units themselves. And so as we look at moving forward, many significant changes have occurred, starting with communications being number one. And I'll close with this. The Railroad Commission of Texas has been talking with the Public Utility Commission, who's been talking to the Division of Emergency Management on an ongoing basis. There have been constant gatherings of stakeholders to make certain that the right improvements are being made and the right forms of communication enhancements are being conducted that have really making a big difference on our system.
Thank you. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I was appointed to be on this Texas Energy Reliability Council that Todd was referring to broadly, with the Railroad Commission and members of the gas industry, members of the electric industry, the PUC, and then several state agencies. And it's led by the Texas Department of Emergency Management. We worked through this winter storm Landon about 3 weeks ago, and it was a kind of daily meeting. Was actually reminiscent of what I lived under as an informally when I was a regulator here in the 90s. Was really that side by side shoulder work. We could automate the hell out of everything and put men and women on Mars, but at the end of the day, it's that interpersonal contact between and among people who care about Texas, that care about keeping people alive and keeping infrastructure adequate, that is going to get us through. And so I'd love to automate it. We do want to build in a level of redundancy that we don't yet have. I think as the state is growing so fast, we have not kept up on the energy infrastructure front. And I think that's a message that all of us, I think, got in this storm last year. But, at the end of the day, it is that smooth relationships that are going to be important. And so, we've got two different industry models. The gas industry is under one model and the electric's under another. Their product moves at the 20, 30 miles an hour in a pipeline, and electricity moves at the speed of light. So you've got just some fundamental physical differences between the two. But, when I was at FERC, I regulated both gas and electric. And so we do have to get some more kind of business symmetry here. And I think that the Turk, again, this council of both industries is going to be working on that short and long term to make sure those issues don't really become obstacles in a way that makes the average Texan just scratch their head and go, why in the hell couldn't they figure that out? Well, we are. We should have, but it's better late than never.
Thank you. And Annette, I want to come back to you. I know we've already touched on some of the changes that have occurred in terms of what's changed to address the problems we face in the power generation side and transmission, but is there anything else you would like to mention?
Yeah, the changes are significant in terms of developments post-storm. Regulatory bodies are communicating like they never have before, and those processes are being put in place to be sustainable. This is not a one-time thing. This is going to be an ongoing effort. The resources devoted to it have been staggering. And I think Pat and I would both, maybe Ty, we'd all be remiss to not point out the Railroad Commission and PUC staff and others who have been working unbelievable hours at low pay and doing a phenomenal job. I've been very impressed with staff. They've really ginned out some good work. So they're all communicating together, but working very hard on this. So I would say today, in one of my concluding remarks, I would say, I think ERCOT's probably the most reliable electric grid in the world. After everything we've done, it's only going to get better. And so I think there's a lot that has changed. It's going to make it even better for us going forward.
Well, that is a natural lead in to this question, which is it enough? If Winter Storm Uri occurred again today, and obviously we're having quite a cold spell in Austin today, how would the grid perform? And would it be enough?
Who would you like to tackle that one?
All of you.
Looks like Pat's ready to
go.
Well, I won't take on. I think everybody's going to be on their best behavior after you get your hand caught in the cookie jar. You're really good for the next few days. So I think for the next couple of years, we're going to all be on our best behavior. What changed this time is now that got locked into law. The legislature said you're going to put out winterization standards, and so the PUC did. And I see there's a question in the sidebar on this, but the PUC did adopt. 2011 was our last major outage. It was about 1/4 as broad and deep and long as the current one, but the feds looked at that one and promoted some changes, which the PUC just adopted point blank this year. They adopted them in the fall, and they were audited before January. And all the power plants weatherization efforts were audited by independent people that ERCOT worked with as well. So that was a major step, certainly. And where like I said, it's more of a 2-year process to identify the critical parts of the gas system and get those winterized as well. And Todd can speak to that. But that's an important first step. And I do think that makes a lot of difference. All these other things, whether we get more batteries online, whether we can build more lines to places outside Texas and not jeopardize our jurisdiction, which quick answer to that is yes, we can. Whether we can do more on the demand side, which I've already talked about that. And again, this issue of making sure that we can break apart the system so that if we do have to do rolling outages, they're much shorter and they're able to actually roll so that people could be off for an hour, but on for an hour, off for an hour, on for an hour, as happened in some parts of Texas, where people were inconvenienced, but not dead. The dramatic outcomes that we saw in Houston and parts of the other parts of the state. So those type of things. So I would say yes, we're on the right direction. I don't know that I could ever sit there and say we're ever totally done. I don't have to say that because I'm not in the political world. I'm in my world, but I think we all know that we're very much under the microscope, and we have to bend over backwards. I have to certify the beginning of this, at the mid part of this month, that my batteries are in full compliance with the weatherization. I have to do that with my wet signature every year. And ask any CEO who's in the post-Sarbanes-Oxley era, and I think a lot of our members on here sit on corporate boards and know this signature, but the CEO and CFO have to affirm that they're in full compliance with all the disclosure requirements that the federal law requires. That's a big thing to do. When you're putting, it's not just sending it to somebody down in the workroom to sign it. It's you. You're the buck where the buck stops. And so that again, all these things on their own don't solve the problem, but collectively, it really creates a very different situation than we had the day before the lights went out.
Yeah. Go ahead, Todd.
No, well, I was just going to add that without a question, without a shadow of a doubt, things are better today than they were pre-Uri. There have been so many things that have come together in such a unique way that has readied our system up and down the line. Power generators have winterized by law. The mapping will occur, but I want to say this: of things that might need to be looked at as we think about reliability and what types of changes that we need to see. I think it's important to, when we think about the natural gas system, it's used as a broad term, but there's production, there's transmission, there's distribution, there's natural gas power plants. And so there are many factors along that supply chain. All of them are different. They're much different, in fact. And so we're looking at each one of those components. I think there's a perception there that if natural gas had been winterized, then you wouldn't have had any problems with flow. And I think that's a misperception, because if you remember the ERCOT data, that outages were 12% due to fuel limitations is very important. But we also need to remember this, is that in weather events and field operations, no matter what operators do to ready their systems and to utilize best practices, you're going to have a decline in production of anywhere range. If you keep the power on, it'll be limited to 10 to, 30%. We've got a great side-by-side comparison of fields with power on and power out on our website, texelga.org/winter ready. I encourage you to look at. But my point in saying it is this: knowing that production is going to decline to some degree, that production is still going to exceed what is needed for electric power generation. And then if you think about the 17.5 billion cubic feet of withdrawal capacity that we have on a daily basis for Texas, that combined far exceeds what the Texas needs are, even during extreme weather events. And so someone owns that gas, right? It's not a product that's just put on the shelf. People have firm contracts for supply, firm contracts for transmission. And these are the types of things that we need to look at to ensure that power generators have the right market signals to ensure that they have not only firm contracts for supply and transmission, but for the volumes they need and the duration they need to meet it during the peak capacity demand. Because if you rely on anything else, you're not going to have the gas you need. If you're the last person in line at the concert, or let me put it this way, if you're the last person to buy season tickets for the Texas Aggies next season, because we all know what a great year we're going to have, you probably can't get tickets. And if you do, they'll be so high. And so we need to look at that part of it to make certain that people are signed up for the gas they need and do that pre-planning that's necessary.
We have a number of questions coming in through the chat room, but before we go to that, I want to ask about the elephant in the room. And Ned, I'm going to start with you. And the elephant in the room is this: will the Texas grid remain independent, or will it become connected to the eastern and western grids, allowing energy to flow either direction across state lines? Ned, we'll let you bat first.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I know Pat's listening intently. This is a great question, and it's part of the infrastructure comment I was going to make about what's changed as well. Part of what's happened in the last year is it spurred tremendous dialogue about what else can we be doing here, what other kinds of resources can we tap, all that's going on. There is a transmission line that's proposed and underway right now. They haven't laid or started moving ground yet, but they're working on it. Southern Cross, which is a 2,000 to 3,000 megawatt transmission line that can move power bidirectionally from ERCOT to over into Mississippi, Alabama area. Okay. That's important for a couple of reasons. You can now export a lot of surplus wind and solar energy from ERCOT to those states that really don't have any wind or solar resources. And when we need power here, this remote region, and we're talking about 800 to 1,000 miles away, that's not getting impacted by the weather we're having, can now import 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts into ERCOT to help hold us up. Okay. That line is not being built on the ratepayers' backs. It's private capital. It's being built competitively. So they're only going to capitalize on those price differences between the two regions to make money. This is what we need more of. This is the Pat Wood model from 20 years ago of making markets drive these kinds of decisions, not putting the costs on the back of the ratepayers. These kinds of projects are game changers. And I think you're going to see only more of this. I think Southern Cross is only the first of what could be more lines that don't even interconnect with ERCOT, but they may run over from the eastern area where they need renewables into the Panhandle and into West Texas and pick up wind energy and export it out of Texas. And now we've got an exportable commodity in Texas that'll earn us huge tax revenues and infrastructure investment. So it's very promising.
So the answer to your question, Cher, is yes, we will be independent. And yes, we will have more interconnections. And I should tip my hat to our former Congressman Joe Barton from North Texas. He was my oversight chairman when I was at the FERC, but he put in there in 2005 in the Energy Policy Act some small language that makes it real clear that if Texas is ordered to interconnect with any outside entity, and again, what Ned's talking about are voluntary projects that make a lot of economic sense, that have already gotten FERC approval and have already gotten PUC approval. Mm-hmm. So they're done regulatorily. It's just really an economic issue. But if they ever got ordered to interconnect, it would not change the jurisdictional status, and that's in the federal law. So it's kind of become a fun issue for the kind of Texans and the non-Texans to kick around. But honestly, as a practical matter, it was resolved a generation ago in federal law that Texas will stay jurisdictionally independent. And we've benefited from that. I shall say, as a regulator, it was wonderful. And Todd was in the legislature at the time. They gave the PUC the authority to really restructure the market with a lot of guidance from the legislature. And we got to do the whole thing. We got to fix it soup to nuts because we had full jurisdiction over that. Now, other states can clearly go forward with that. They've got to work more closely with the federal partner at FERC. I haven't been at FERC. I can tell you they're a nice partner to have. It's not some evil empire part of the federal government. At least they weren't in my day. But it's harder to do. It's not impossible. We have competitive states all over the country. But what's nice here is that we got to do it with one consistent vision under then Governor Bush, and then we move forward in a bipartisan manner. Bipartisan House and Senate really said we want to be part of this. This should be good for customers of all sorts, big and small, rural and urban. We want it to help do something for the environment. I think none of us dreamed we would become the number one wind and now I think number two solar country in the world. Not even talking about other states. California is a little ahead of us on solar, but by the end of next year, even Texas will take ahead of that. But I tell people, look, God gave us a lot of resources and he gave us
Uh-oh. Pat throws up on us.
I'm just glad he's a
Wanna
handsome
go
man.
ahead?
Well, I'll just find out when Pat comes back in, but I think what was done in Texas is phenomenal. Texans have benefited. Consumers in Texas have experienced some of the lowest rates. Pat, you froze up for a little bit, so we were.
I noticed that now.
It was a great view, though. Don't worry. We've tweeted it a few times. It's on Instagram. It's good. We have benefited from your work, and those of you in Texas is great. So before there's any significant changes, we just want to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. It won't undermine our ability to be competitive and to have the kind of cost savings, but also meet the reliability standards that I think we all agree that we're expecting here.
Thank all of you for addressing that question. It is one I hear a lot and often see in various articles, whether online or in print. We do have some great questions in a few minutes. I'm just going to start with one of the first ones, and I think, Todd, this one is probably yours. Can you comment a bit more on the current progress of weatherizing the Texas energy systems and what is yet to be done? Do we have an estimate of the cost of these efforts?
Well, as I had indicated, that companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year already on employing weatherization protocols. The Railroad Commission of Texas has done some surveys. They're estimating that about 98% of the facilities were weatherized, with the remainder of them in the process of doing so. And so I think there's a great deal of that's being done. The mapping process is going to have a heavy jurisdictional role and regulatory role of making certain that those assets directly tied to power generation units, without a shadow of doubt, are meeting the types of standards that the expectations are, so that product will flow. I think we need to remember that in Texas, we produce, I don't know, 25, 26 billion cubic feet of gas per day. Electric power generators on a typical winter day in Texas usually use between 4, maybe 5 BCF. And so we have much more volume than what we need. And so of that volume, of that 25 to 26 billion cubic feet a day, over 80% goes to uses other than for electrical generation. So it's not an issue of not having enough. It's an issue of, are we planning appropriately? And are those end users securing what they need in an efficient way to get it to where it needs to be? And I think that's what we need to focus on, is that storage capacity and that last mile. And are they designed to get what they need?
Thank you very much for that. I was just looking through here in terms of where we've touched on some of these questions already. One is, and Ned or Pat, which interconnects would be the most promising for Texas grid reliability?
You know, I mean, there are 2 to pick from, and actually a third. There's Mexico as well. And I work with, the Hunt family, and they built a DC tie, which connects about 300 megawatts with Mexico grid. So that's a good template for what we've done elsewhere. We've got about 1,000 megawatts total connecting Mexico and the east meaning Oklahoma and Louisiana, probably something out west. I mean, certainly that demand in California, Arizona, there, those regions have a lot of renewable energy already, but that ability to balance it based on time of day, if it's dark in Texas, it still may be sunny in California, will be sunny in California, and having the ability to move back and forth to the west. So I would say probably a mix of all of them would be a way to make the system more robust. Yeah, I don't want anybody to assume that that would have kept the blackouts or the rolling outages from happening last year, because tying up getting 20,000 megawatts of power from outside just wasn't going to happen. I mean, these other states were freezing cold as well,
right,
and they were using every bit of gas and electricity they could get. So it's not like in that particular crisis that would have been a whole lot availing to us from the outside. But again, every little bit helps. And it's not going to be the same kind of crisis next time around. It might be something totally different. And then as Ned mentioned, it's not just for the the emergency events where this is important, but it's also important when you've got just normal commerce. Think about how wonderful this country became when President Eisenhower got the interstate highway system built. I mean, that kind of commerce is exactly what we're talking about with connecting out the grid. And so if we have that sort of back and forth between Texas energy, not just gas going in a pipeline, but electricity of all sorts going on a wire, that's good for Texas. That brings money home to our state and jobs to our state. So, fundamentally, that's what all this is about. It's economic development. So what are we doing to really enhance that? Opening gates and building a strong highways certainly is a big part of that.
The National Renewable Energy Laboratory put out a lot of graphics and a lot of numbers about all this. And one of the ones that caught my eye was that a land area the size of Lake Michigan is large enough to power the entire country with solar energy. Okay, so if you look at a map of the US, Lake Michigan is not that large compared to the country. Lake Michigan would easily fit in West Texas, okay, where we have world-class solar capacity. That's why I believe you're going to have more lines running like giant straws from West Texas east, where they really don't have that kind of world-class solar capacity. And you can't put wind turbines in the piney woods. Todd Staples knows that all too well, and so does Pat. You can't do it. So does it make sense to clear cut thousands and thousands of square miles of piney woods to put in solar panels in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas? Absolutely not. That makes absolutely no sense. I think you're going to see them trying to tap the vast resources we have here, and they are truly vast, to bring power east. I just don't see a way around it. I invite Pat to disagree with me, but I just think the potential there is huge.
I love the thought of Texas. I mean, we've powered the country for what, a century or two? What's another century to come? Let's keep doing it. Just whatever God gave us, we'll figure out how to make money off of it. So let's do it.
Okay, well, let's move to another question, and we have about 10 minutes max left to go before closing. This question is, have there been discussions about different pricing mechanisms that might be enacted during extreme weather events? My sense is a number of banks ended up getting back the keys on some wind farms in Texas due to the extreme impact of max pricing. Who would like to tackle that one?
Ned, if you want to do that, I'll jump in when you're done, or otherwise.
Boy, have there been discussions about different pricing mechanisms? Let me kind of break this down, that might be enacted during extreme weather events. Yes, lots of discussions about different pricing mechanisms during extreme weather events, and there's already been changes. There are new services being offered to provide incentives. One of the concerns here is you have to split this up into long-term and short-term to try to be as quick as I can. Under the short-term issue is, how are we addressing this problem? How are we dealing with current reliability? The longer-term issue is, if we just implemented a rule that messes up the long-term view of power generation additions in ERCOT? And if the answer is yes, then you've really messed things up. So everything they're doing is with a long-term view. What do we implement to make sure that this market continues to attract capital investment here to build more generation resources? Those are forefront in their minds as they implement all these new services and create incentives to build. But at the same time, not price industry out of the state. So it's a real delicate balance here between making sure you allow the generators to earn enough, but not too much. So all that's being very carefully analyzed by a lot of really smart people, way smarter than me. But yes, that's all under discussion. Pat, you want to dogpile that one?
I think there's kind of the PUC, and I will say the governor found some really superb people. I mean, I don't think ever in history the PUC's ever completely wiped clean, but all three commissioners resigned after the energy event last February. And the governor appointed 4 more to a now larger commission, 5-member commission. And they've been really involved in really 2 separate issues. And one of them is to look at what went wrong in the past. And let's fix that. So I call that the URI issues. And the legislature, again, spoke to that clearly, gave a lot of tools, a lot of authority, penalty authority, including $1 million a day type authority to both the railroad and the PUC commissions to really oversee the industries in a more hands-on kind of way. So that's one thing. The second thing that they were told to do is look at the grid that is changing going forward, because I will tell you, I never dreamed that we would be where we are on renewable energy, but the world seems to be kind of plummeting that way really quickly. And in the past, even when we set up our competitive market here, we had the ability to, when I was here, we looked at Australia and England and South America and Pennsylvania and California and the New England states and everywhere to kind of get ideas about what went right and what didn't go so well and make sure that Texas doesn't make any of the same mistakes. We're in a place now where nobody's been before, which is this grid where I think by 2035, let's say, to be generous, 80% of the hours of the year, electricity will be basically free because it'll be generated by free resources. So the marginal cost of electricity from wind and solar and nuclear almost is zero, not quite. The cost of uranium is not zero, but it's low when spread over. So those things will pretty much, those carbon-free resources will be clear in the market 80% of the year. But in the hot summer and the cold winter, that other 20% of the year, it's going to be all hands on deck. We're going to need all the gas units and all the coal units and whatever technologies we've got to clean up carbon or whatever else we want to clean up from those two technologies. We better figure out by then, because I for one think those resources need to be part of the mix, but they're not going to be as cost effective as those others, but they're dependable because they are dispatchable. And so the PUC right now is going through a proceeding where they're looking at how do we keep around those resources, and not only keep them around, but with all the Bitcoin miners coming here and all the people moving here from California and Illinois and all the other states that are kind of messing up their tax structures and scaring the people away. And just the normal growth, legal and illegal, that we've got here in Texas. All that is creating what will be a humongous future upward in power consumption. Electric vehicles, to say another great big one. The electrification of home heating. Again, I'm a big natural gas fan, so I kind of wish that one were a little slower than it is. But in any event, all these things are driving the electric demand up. So we're not going to only need to keep the gas plants and the coal plants and all the other renewables, of course, that we've got today, but build more. And so we've got to make sure that our market sends those price signals that are adequate for an investor to say, yes, I'm going to build down there in ERCOT and be part of that great story of economic development, but I want to make sure I get a decent return for my investment, because that's not a risk-free environment. That's a wide competitive market that's sometimes Wild West competitive. So I need to make sure I can get some money back. So that's important. And I think that'll be a part of what this PUC is looking at for the other half of their job. Again, look backward, fix the things that happened in Uri, but more importantly, make sure we've got the rules of the road set up for the world going forward. And so when the questioner asked about different pricing mechanisms in the future, that's really what we're doing, is to make sure that Texas, as we lead the world figuring out what that future power grid and future power market actually looks like and how does it work and make it work efficiently and reliably, we're going to figure it all out here first. And so who'd ever thought in red Texas, we're going to figure out how to solve the green puzzle, but we got no choice because it's coming here. God gave us the resources. We got to figure out how to do it right.
Thank you so much, Pat. And we're close to being out of time, but I want to give certainly Todd and Ned an opportunity to make a closing remark. I'll start with you, Todd. Any key takeaways for you?
Sure. Just a few quick observations. One, to give some data to back up Pat's statement about the energy needs. I'm an oil and gas guy, and we believe in an all of the above energy approach. The world is going to need more energy, not less. We're going to need everything to function. We've got 7 to 7.5 billion people today. By 2050, that's going to be 9.5 to 10 billion people. We're going to need more forms of energy. We're focused on a lower emissions future. And so using technology and breakthrough pioneering innovations is certainly the way we're going to get there. The second observation is Texas is ready. For those of you that live in Texas or you're contemplating moving your business to Texas, you can know that our system has made fundamental changes to be prepared. And as Ned said earlier, we're not finished. We're just getting started in making certain the types of things that we do are going to be impactful for both an efficient grid and a competitive grid and a reliable grid. The third thing is Texas has an abundance of natural gas. We have so much natural gas, we are exporting over half of what we produce on a daily basis. So our issue is not that we don't have enough gas. Our issue is, are we sending the right market signals for power generators that need that gas to pre-plan ahead of time in order to make certain that they have the firm contract for volume and duration of what they need for supply and transmission? And I think those are the kind of things we need to look forward as we move forward. And since we're close on time, I'll wrap up with those. Thank you, Sherry. It's been good to be with Pat and Ned.
Thank you, Todd. And Ned, final takeaways from you?
I'll say it again. I think ERCOT is positioned as the finest electric grid in the world. And I say that after however many years I've been working in this business. Pat and company figured out how to break up the utilities and create a wires network in this state that has invited to the table well over $100 billion worth of private investment. And that's what's powering us today. It's not in your rates. It's purely off balance sheet stuff or off rate stuff. And that is powering us, including practically the entire wind and solar industry that's built up recently. So this state is in a great position for the future. We are set up to embrace hydrogen. We are set up to embrace any future for natural gas. We are set up for wind, solar, fuel cells. The grid is just in a unique position right now to embrace everything new as well as what is already in existence. So very, very bright future for ERCOT.
Thank you, Ned. And thank you, Pat, Ned, and Todd, all of you, for such an outstanding conversation. I'm sure we've all gained some useful insights. And as a reminder to attendees, the survey link is in the chat box and will also be sent via email after the program. We value your feedback and appreciate you taking just a few minutes to complete the survey. Mark your calendars for our next virtual program on March 31st, Evolving Cybersecurity Threats and Dangers, an update from the front lines. This concludes our program for today. We look forward to seeing you on the 31st, and thank you again, Pat, Ned, and Todd.
Thank you, Sherry.
Take care.
Enjoyed it. See y'all later.
Bye-bye.